Who will be at ease and who will suffer depression? Who will be sociable and who will be debilitated from anxiety? Who will navigate stress and who will undergo a panic attack? Who will be visionary and who will hallucinate visions? And asking the question, who shall live and who shall die, I also ask the question, who by mental illness? The answer to this latter question came in the form of a phone call 2 years ago on New Year's Day. Mike is dead. Mike, the first person to welcome me to middle school. Mike, my friend who sat next to me in chemistry and Spanish. Mike, my running partner in gym class. Mike, the boy with whom I emerged as a teen, the teen with whom I became a man. Mike, the man who danced the hora with me at my wedding. Mike is dead. I didn't even need to hear how it happened, because I already knew. Mike had long suffered from depression, and Mike had succumbed to mental illness. At least that's the narrative that I had created. Tabloids saw it differently. George Washington bridge jumper had debt woes, read the headlines of one of the tabloids. But Mike didn't kill himself because he had debt. Mike had debt because he had depression. His mental illness was a war of attrition, slowly eating away at him, eroding his relationships with his friends and family, causing him to accrue unnecessary debt. We all tried to help him. We all tried to reach out to him. But depression is a terrible disease. Depression killed Mike. In case you haven't figured out, this sermon is about mental illness. It's a call for mental health awareness. And I might not have given it if it weren't for a long string of phone calls that we received this summer, all of which were from people suffering from mental illness or people who had lost a loved one to mental illness. I tried so hard not to bring our community's stress to my home, to my wife, and to my toddler, Lila. There were nights, though, that I couldn't sleep as I ruminated on the pain of our community. Mental illness had already taken my friend Mike in years past, and in my role as a rabbi, I've sat with people suffering with mental illness. I've visited psychiatric facilities, sat with teenagers at their bedsides after their attempts to end their lives. Began to realize after call came in, this is what I needed to speak about these high holidays: mental health. There are 3 things today that I want us to consider and I want us to take away as individuals and as a community. 3 things. Have empathy. Lift the stigma and change the narrative. But before I explore these, let me tell you how I got there. I began my process of thinking about this subject by doing what I normally do. I opened the texts of our tradition, the Torah, the Talmud, the Mishnah, other Jewish philosophical texts. And what I found, well, there wasn't much. And when mental illness was discussed, it came from a place of unexpected ignorance. Take Shimon ben Gamliel, the head of the rabbinic court in the 2nd century. Shimon ben Gamliel says that the main cause of shigayon, of craziness, is laziness. The rabbis begin to address and categorize mental illness in the Talmud with the term shoteh, a wanderer. They begin by describing such a person as someone who goes out alone in the middle of the night despite the danger. They describe this person as someone who sleeps in graveyards. The philosophical and legal scholar Maimonides says a shoteh is someone who runs around naked and throws rocks. For anyone who's labeled as a shoteh, the rabbis set limits upon them. Anyone who has this mental illness is no longer obligated to mitzvot, to commandments. And the rabbis even go as far to say that mental illness is a form of sinfulness. The great Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, 18th century rabbi who led a sizable following, said, being happy all the time is a great mitzvah. Yet Rabbi Nachman himself suffered bouts of depression, and modern psychologists and psychiatrists believe that he may have suffered bipolar disorder. You can't always boil things down to a Bobby McFerrin cliche like, don't worry, be happy. Someone with mental illness doesn't have an on and off switch that enables them to regulate emotions, as much as someone with cancer doesn't have the ability to turn off cancer. My intention isn't to scald our tradition for its lack of understanding. How could they know what we know today? There had been no medical studies of mental illness, and scientific knowledge of brain chemistry was non-existent then and still in its infancy now. But it's not that our biblical ancestors didn't suffer from mental illness. They surely did. They just had no ways to properly understand it, no ways to respond thoughtfully to those who suffer. Consider Moses, who in the midst of wandering in the wilderness with the Israelites, cries out, Lo uchal anochi levadi leset et kol ha'am hazeh ki kaved mimeni. I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too great for me. If this is how you intend to treat me, God, just go ahead, kill me. Do me a favor, God. Put me out of my misery. Or Jonah, who we read about on Yom Kippur afternoon, who declares, Va'ata Adonai kachna et nafshi. Please, God, take my life, for I would rather die than live. Or even David, who in the book of Psalms cries out, Me amikim kariticha Adonai. From the lowest depths I call out to you. But perhaps one of the most moving stories comes from the Talmud. Rabbi Eliezer, one of our great rabbinic sages, becomes ill. What kind of illness? The text does not say. His friend Rabbi Yochanan went to him and found Rabbi Eliezer in a dark room, an apparent metaphor for an emotional sadness. Rabbi Yochanan uncovers the shades to find Rabbi Eliezer crying. Why are you crying? Asks Rabbi Yochanan. Before Eliezer could answer, Rabbi Yochanan proceeds to demonstrate that they did not teach pastoral care in the yeshiva, nor do they have any understanding of mental illness. Rabbi Yochanan tries to infer the reason for what seems to be depression. Perhaps you think you haven't studied enough Torah, he rhetorically asks. Rabbi Eliezer is silent. And in an attempt to comfort him further, Rabbi Yochanan continues, perhaps you're weeping because you're poor. Rabbi Eliezer remains silent. Rabbi Yochanan goes on to ask if Rabbi Eliezer is weeping over a lost child. Silence. And then Rabbi Eliezer offers us a glimpse into what it's like to suffer from depression. He said, I'm crying because all of the beauty in the world is fading. I'm crying because all of the beauty in the world is fading. And then Rabbi Yochanan does something right. He cries along with Rabbi Eliezer. And the story leads me to my first major point, that is the importance of empathy. Because words aren't the cure for those with mental illness, but empathy helps. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan does. Well, Rabbi Yochanan eventually gets there. Before he does, though, Yochanan's words sound similar to some of the modern things that those with depression hear from the world around them. Cheer up. You have it so good. Why aren't you happy? Happiness is a choice. What do you have to be sad about? Snap out of it. Why can't you just be normal? These are words of judgment, not ones of understanding. We often think we have a perspective that can help someone who's mentally ill see the world the right way. But often our words make things worse. Empathy isn't the solution, but it's a start. It's a start to making someone whose world is oft misunderstood feel heard. Rabbi Acha Bar Chanina, a rabbinic sage, teaches an impactful lesson in the Talmud. He says, Kol hamevaker choleh notel echad mishishim b'tza'aro. Anyone who visits someone who is ill takes away 1/60th of their pain. The mere act of being present and listening empathetically imparts more healing than any word you might be able to offer. Forget chicken soup as the Jewish penicillin. Empathy is the ultimate Jewish medicine. In the upcoming year, I want us to look at mental illness and our friends and our families suffering from it with empathy. And secondly, I want us to lift the stigma associated with mental illness. Jews throughout the century, humanity as a whole, have been plagued by mental illness. And one of the fundamental problems that we face today is we don't know how to talk about it. Or at the very least, we talk about it in a whisper. Not too long ago, people would whisper the word cancer, or use euphemisms like the bug to describe HIV or AIDS. We've come so far in reducing the stigma in our conversations over illness, but why are we not talking about those who go through bouts of panic attacks, teens with eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia, friends and family debilitated by obsessive compulsive disorders, our family members who are estranged because of their schizophrenia, our parents who are suffering from depression? And lifting the stigma, let's talk about mental illness from a place of love and support and not from shame. Tonight and today, when we call out our Misha Beirach list, I pray that those who suffer mental illness are included. I pray that we have the courage to include depression, social anxiety, OCD, along with physical illnesses like pneumonia. The pain of mental illness is real, and so too is the danger of it. Let's lift the stigma. And lastly, I want to see us change the narrative for mental illness. Tabloids that report suicide rarely ever report the disease that strikes down nearly 40,000 Americans every year. And no, not all suicides are a psychiatric disorder, but 90% of all suicide victims have a diagnosable psychiatric disorder, according to the American Foundation of Suicide Studies. And it's not just the tabloids that fail to speak about the relationship between suicide and psychiatric disorders. It's a terrible habit in the way that we speak. He killed himself. I can't believe that he or she could do that to her family. I'm angry with him because I didn't think he can do that. He didn't even consider me. We too often fail to remember the real perpetrator: mental illness. Let's change the narrative. Tribute suffering and passing of loved ones not to killing themselves, but when proper, to the tribulations of mental illness. In supporting those with mental illness, there is little that we have control over. But the one area where we do indeed have control is in the narrative, the way we talk about mental illness with our friends our family, and in public. Now, I look into our community, and I know that studies tell me that 1/5 of you suffer from a mental health issue. 1/5. I know that when during the dramatic reading of Unetana Tokef, when we ask who by fire and who by water, who by strangling and who by disease, you might be thinking, who by mental illness? Or even more scary, perhaps, how shall I take my own life in this year? Perhaps by water, perhaps by fire, perhaps by strangling. If you're out there and looking for support, we are here for you. And if you're interested in being a part of our mental health initiative here at the Jewish Center, either as someone who needs support or someone who wants to support others, please send me an email after Rosh Hashanah. I started out with questions, and I'll end with a new set of them. Who of us shall be empathetic to those who suffer mental illness, and who shall stand idly by? Who shall lift the stigma of mental illness, and who shall perpetuate it? Who shall change the narrative of mental illness, and who shall read the tabloid headlines? Shana Tova.